Hello, juniors and seniors again. Welcome to another AP overview video. In this video, we're going to be talking about the poetry section. Now, some of you might be a little bit intimidated. Poetry, how do you read and analyze poetry? It's the same way you read and analyze any other piece of literature, right? Whether you're reading or analyzing a passage from a novel or a play. You've had poems in your English classes where you've broken them down and looked at the DDIST analysis, and you've discussed themes in poems and so on. And that's exactly what happens in all of the essay sections, particularly the poetry and the prose section. They are testing you on the very skills that you have been taught in your English classes from freshman year. That is the skills of argumentation and analysis. All that work we've done on thesis statements, debatable claims, linking textual elements to thematic claims in a thesis, topic sentences that reflect the thesis and that have textual elements and thematic claims. And then, of course, use of evidence and analysis of evidence, that DDIST work that probably you sometimes, more DDIST. Well, here we are, you're about to take the AP. Those are the skills that the AP is assessing, right? How well can you read literature and write cogently and persuasively about literature in thesis-driven format. So you've got those skills, right? And I think a lot of what I'll be talking to you about in the poetry and prose overview videos, right? It's going to be a re-emphasis of a lot of the things you've already learned. So let's dive in, the poetry prompt. Right? We're back here at the Lit AP exam resources page. We're looking at workshop 2 preparation for the poetry prompt. The below video is going to walk you through a couple of subpages. Recent poetry prompts, a breakdown of what to expect in the poetry prompt, and then the work you'll need to prepare in advance of the workshop. So let's go to this first page. All right, let me give you an overview of this page real fast. I have put in an image of the three recent poetry prompts: the 2018 poetry prompt, the 2017 poetry prompt beneath that, and then the 2016 prompt beneath that, right? Let's go to the first one, right? Here is the prompt itself, right? And there is, the specific ask that they have for you. And I've put it up here, right? Just so I can highlight a few things as we walk through it, right? So the prompt says to carefully read all of Senior's 2005 poem, Plants. Then in a well-organized essay, analyze how the poet portrays a complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life. You may wish to consider the author's use of literary techniques as syntax, diction, and figurative language. So this is very emblematic of what you're going to get, right? They're always going to be asking you to pinpoint how particular techniques underscore some idea or message, et cetera, et cetera. So let's break it down, right? First of all, right, when we look at this page, if we were to boldface a couple of things, right? Or let's say highlight, let's highlight instead. I want to draw your attention to this word right here, how, okay? You can expect to find how. Let me unhighlight that. Hold on a second. I don't know why and was highlighted. How is something that you can expect to see. How means what? How means technique, right? How a message is conveyed, right? So the first thing you should always circle is this word how the poet portrays this bigger idea. And this is the sort of idea that you're going to need to focus on, right? The complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life, right? Now then it says, you may wish to consider the author's use of such literary techniques as syntax, diction, and figurative language. When they list those things for you, that means, yeah, consider those. You don't have to necessarily consider all three, but certainly at least two, right? What kind of diction is used, what sort of sentence structure is used for syntax, what sort of figurative language is used, right? And then what I want to do is I've provided a structural model for what a thesis might look like, right? A kind of formula, if you will, right? And it might look something like this: through, in brackets, the defined techniques you'll examine, whichever the ones that you want to focus on, given the list that they've given you. The speaker illustrates, and then that's where you have to define things, right? What you pinpoint as the complex relationship among the speaker, the implied audience, and plant life. You have to define what that is. Don't just repeat that phrase. right? They want to see what you can come up with, right? That is the claim that you're going to make. Notice that I've used the speaker because in poems we have speakers and not narrators, right? That's a point I'll emphasize in another video, right? Speakers, not narrators. Just as we also have stanzas, we don't have paragraphs in poems, right? So what might a good thesis look like? And so here I provided a thesis of a student who scored an 8, upper range level, that is, right? I already talked about the scoring guide in the previous video on this prompt. And note here, the student used 2 sentences rather than 1. Typically, you want to try to boil it down in 1 sentence, but okay, it's fine. This is the AP. What do? They reward students for what they do well. So if your thesis ends up coming in 2 sort of sentences rather than 1, it's not the end of the world as long as it's clear. You know what you're talking about, and your analysis in your body paragraphs systematically underscores what you've established you're going to write about. Let's take a look at this one. The speaker warns the audience not to underestimate the clever machinations of plants, characterizing them as manipulative beings whose goal is to take over the world. The speaker argues his point through sinister diction, personification of plant life, and direct audience address to the audience. Sure, this could have been combined in one, right? You could have been something like that, the structural model through sinister diction, personification of plant life, and direct address to the audience. The speaker warns the audience not to do this, right? But it's 2 sentences, it's fine for the reasons I've already mentioned. One thing I want to point out is that there are 2 very clear things here, right? Notice A, right? The techniques, they're defined. The writer doesn't say through diction, personification, and direct address, right? It's very specific. What kind of diction? What kind of personification do you mean, right? And here I like that this direct address to the audience, right? That's another way to sort of pinpoint the textual element you're going to address, right? And in terms of the argument being made, it's this claim over here, right? How those 3 techniques illustrate this claim right here, right, if you will, right? Now, in terms of lining up these 3 different techniques, that probably sets up the body paragraphs, right? One body paragraph will pinpoint how the sinister diction underscores this claim. Another body paragraph will pinpoint how the personification of plant life underscores the claim being made, right? And finally, another paragraph, the direct address to the audience, underscores that same claim. It's the same idea that you're proving in the 3 different paragraphs, and you're saying, or this student is saying, the poem does it in these 3 particular ways. Okay? Let's move on to another one. Here is the image of the poem, right? And the prompt. And I've done the same thing here. I have highlighted the prompt here. I've given a structural model for what your thesis might look like. Then I've given you a student sample. Let's go through those really quickly. Here's the prompt given. The poem is by Rachel M. Harper. Read the poem carefully. Then consider such elements as imagery, form, and tone. Considering such elements as imagery, form, and tone, write a well-organized essay in which you analyze the relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family. Now, this prompt does not use the word how, but it's implied, right? When it says considering such elements as imagery, form, and tone, that's the how piece, right? Let's go back to that. That is the how piece right there, right? That these things, right? How do these things address this relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family, right? So those are the techniques you want to consider: imagery, form, and tone. And form could be something as simple as, all right, we have a 3-stanza structure here. It could be as simple as that, possibly 1, 2, 3 stanzas. 3 parts, right? You could look at that as almost 3 parts of the poem, right? And then, okay, you're going to look at those elements, and you're going to need to define what this is, given your reading of the poem, right? So a structural model for the thesis, right? And notice how boldface purpose verbs suggests, it could be underscores, reveals, illustrates. Through the defined techniques you'll examine, the speaker suggests, again, what you pinpoint as a relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family. All right, so what might a thesis look like? Here's the thesis of a student who scored an 8, an upper range level, that is, on this prompt, right? So let's take a look at it. Through her use of comparative metaphorical language and auditory imagery, Harper conveys the timeless and uniquely personal nature of music and its ability to evoke the emotionality of her childhood to her father, right? A nice and compact little thesis statement, right? If we look at that, we have what? It sort of follows the formulas I've laid it out, right? These are the textual elements or the techniques or the devices, all those things mean the same thing, that I'm going to focus on. And notice again, like the last one, this response defines the techniques, right? It doesn't just say something lame like through imagery and tone. What does that mean? All poems have imagery and tone, right? It's through her use of comparative metaphorical language and auditory imagery, a particular kind of imagery. And notice that this writer chose to focus on two of the techniques, not necessarily all three, two. And you can get away with that. You could have two really powerful body paragraphs. And in both those paragraphs, you are doing what, right? Well, this is what the student's going to focus on, right? This idea, the timeless and uniquely personal nature of music and its ability to evoke the emotionality of her childhood or father, right? And notice how that is addressing what they're asking you to address. This poem is asking you to analyze the relationship between music and the speaker's complex memories of her family. This claim here is the response to that, right? So again, it's that two-part dance. You have done this in your English classes, right? It's not just what the text is saying, it's how the text is saying what it's saying, right? All right, let's look at one more. Here is a final from 2016. They did not include the poem in this for copyright reasons, but that's fine. We're just really looking at the language used. And again, I have put the prompt up here so that we can sort of highlight some things. It says, read carefully the following poem by Richard Wilfer, first published in 1949. Then write a essay in which you analyze how the speaker describes the juggler and what that description reveals about the speaker. You may wish to consider poetic elements such as imagery, figurative language, and tone, right? Wow, once again, what do we have, right? We have that word, how. You can count on that usually being in the prompt. You're certainly going to see that in the prose prompt, which we'll look at in the next video. How does the text suggest something? And then, right, the overall claim you're going to have to look at is this, right? In terms of the how, right, they're telling you what they want you to look at. You may wish to consider poetic elements such as imagery, figurative language, and tone. Pick all three, pick a couple, right? You might find a couple of different kinds of images at work, a couple of different kinds of figurative language, particular kind of tone, or maybe more than one, right? What does a structural model look like? Something like this, perhaps, through the defined techniques you'll examine. The speaker underscores what you pinpoint is revealed about the speaker, given the speaker's description of the juggler, right? Now, what might that look like, right? Here is a thesis of a student who scored a 9 on the prompt. Let's look at that thesis real fast. Through utilization of frequent alliteration and somewhat off-kilter rhyme, as well as diction evoking an almost spiritual level of power in reference to the juggler, the speaker creates an image of a juggler managing to overcome gravity, to lift spirits as well as objects, and reveals their own inability to overcome dull, monotonous days, forever lacking brilliance. Now, you might look at something like this and say, that seems maybe a little bit wordy, right? But again, they're rewarding students for what they do well. The student is cranking out 3 essays in 2 hours, 1 essay, 40 minutes, right? So it may not be the perfect, you know, they're at the AP grading sessions, they're always imagining what would this student have written had he or she been given a lot more time, right? So, you know, I want to emphasize here that we also see that there are the 2 parts here, right? Let's look at this first part of the thesis, right? What is this? What is the writer doing? Defining the particular techniques that he or she will look at, right? Frequent alliteration, somewhat off-kilter rhyme, as well as diction evoking an almost spiritual level of power in reference to the juggler, right? So there are 3 things being looked at there, right? Now, you might say, but wait, how does that fit in with imagery, figurative language, and tone? Maybe it doesn't fully, but you're going to get credit for defining particular elements that you want to look at, right? But more than that, you are not just laundry listing techniques. You're trying to make a larger claim, right? A claim that it addresses this part, right? You know, how does the speaker describe the juggler and what the description reveals about the speaker? There's the answer to that, right? This is the claim that's going to be made, right? It will do this a different color, right? He creates an image of a juggler managing to overcome gravity, to lift spirits as well as objects, and reveals their own inability, right, to overcome dull, monotonous days forever lacking brilliance. Yeah, sure, there is a grammatical error. The speaker is singular and there is plural, but those are the kinds of minor issues that are forgiven if the student, right, has a clear sense of argument. And even though, you know, this thesis might be a little bit wordy, right, there is definite follow through clearly in the body paragraphs. And you can find this essay, right, in that earlier link that I provided for you, right, which enumerates all of the different student responses from these years, right? That gives you a sense of the recent poetry prompts and what you might need to expect. Let's look at one more page together. What did you complete in advance of the poetry workshop, poetry analysis workshop? First of all, make sure that you review these 2 pages, right? Tips on reading poetry and useful poetic terms. And I've got this pulled up. Let's see here. Here is one. You'll want to take a look at this. This is not very long, but it's a fantastic resource, right, for the kinds of questions that you can ask yourself, right? Who's talking? To whom's the speaker talking? What's the dramatic context of the poem? What happens? What kind of conflict's going on? What motivates the speaker to speak now? How does the language of the poem contribute to its meaning? How is the poem organized, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So please look that over in advance. And then finally, I've also provided you this useful poetic terms list, glossary, if you will. And there's a whole bunch. You don't have to go back and learn every single one. You certainly can if you want. What I've done is I've highlighted the ones that you should definitely know before the exam. Words like alliteration, which you probably knew, right? But are you familiar with the word assonance? The repetition of familiar vowel sounds. I rose and told him of my woe, that O sound that recurs, right? Blank verse, caesura. Some of you might be going, wait, what is this stuff? A lot of the highlighted pieces, though, you've seen before. Stuff like connotation, right? Epic, figurative language, free verse, hyperbole or exaggeration, image or imagery, you know that. Irony, you know that, right? Metaphor, metonymy, ode, onomatopoeia, oxymoron, parody, personification. Again, you're going to be familiar with some of these terms. Some you have seen implicitly, right? So just go back and familiarize yourself with the ones. That's a good thing to know before the test and something that you want to review before the review session. Finally, that won't take you too long to review those 2 things. We've given you here two more sample poetry sections that you can look at later. And we want you to write either full essay responses or detailed outline responses to the below 2 poetry analysis prompts. We want you to come in with that work done so that we can talk about your thesis statements, how you developed your piece, right? So on, right? We want to make these workshops as efficient as possible for you and for us, right? If you want to do a full response, that's fine. That's 2 40-minute sessions, right? Not a bad thing to do. And as you do that, you're going to have the poem in front of you. Take 10 to 15 minutes to plan your essay, right? Circle stuff in the prompt. Do a quick outline, and then use the rest of the time just to barrel through your piece, right? You want to make sure you're citing the text, citing quotes, right, in your body paragraphs, as you learn to do in your English classes. If you don't want to write full responses, it's fine. Just get in the habit, you could prepare detailed outline responses. Maybe take 20 minutes or so to read and annotate each of the poems, hammer out a quick thesis statement, right? And then provide topic sentences for your 2 or 3 body paragraphs and indicate the evidence that you'll use for each body paragraph. So please come in with either a couple of essays written or detailed outline responses to these, because in that workshop, we want to talk about thesis statements, what would be the best way into these poems, etc. All right. So thank you for your attention. That concludes the poetry prompt overview. The next video is going to walk you through the post-prompt